Hello. As we move into the latter stages of our course, it will become increasingly important for you to have a really excellent handle on how you've organized the information that you've already collected and are distilling that information into the constellation that will eventually become your final paper. The frameworks that I'll be thinking about during this video can apply to really any kind of file system, whether you use Google Docs or OneDrive or just the normal non-cloud local file system on your device that you use to interact with coursework and the like. All of these frameworks can be applied to whichever method that you prefer to store and share your data. As a side note, I'd really encourage you to think about looking at a cloud solution that totally obviates the need to worry about whether or not something's going to save properly or what happens if your computer crashes or something like that. There's some really wonderful solutions that work with a variety of interfaces and online accounts. So if you want more info about that, just Google it. Let's get started. The most immediate concern whenever you're collecting information is the workflow. How are you going to process that information and how are you going to organize it for sort of later consideration? There's always two short-term goals for any workflow. The first goal is, what are you trying to accomplish? So what's the deliverable that you're trying to deliver? The second question is, how do you plan to accomplish this deliverable? What tools or methods will you be using, and how will you move through the different stages of the workflow itself? A good way to consider the second question is to inventory the resources that you have at your disposal. So for example, maybe you are in an English class, you're primarily using something such as Google Docs or Microsoft Word, any kind of basic text editor, because the deliverables that you'll be turning in an English class are going to be text-based. If you're in a statistics class or maybe an economics class, you might in fact be using Excel or Google Sheets or something similar. So thinking about those resources can help inform the process that you build into your workflow. So again, this is all oriented towards the short-term goal of submitting an assignment or delivering something, as I keep saying. The other thing that you might want to consider when you're thinking about managing your digital assets is less a process kind of thing, which is the workflow side of this whole presentation, and more a information management or information organizational mindset, if you will. So in the second bubble, we have this strategy of information management, and you have an immediate concern, which is organizing all of your information for the now, right, in order to just achieve your workflow, in order to just achieve your deliverable in a sort of immediate sense. The other is to think about retrieval-oriented storage for the future. So will you have to access this information in the future, and what's the best way to organize it right now such that you don't have to spend a lot of time in the future trying to find it? The sweet spot that straddles both the workflow/deliverable side of things and the short and long-term information management side of things is something that we might call practice. So it's a practice that, again, both works for an immediate sort of short-term purpose, but then also towards long-term ends. Ideally, this practical sweet spot abides by two maxims. The first is do it once, and the second is do it well. You don't want to be spending time trying to revise your system and then going back and making sure all of the previous data that you've stored is abiding by that system too. So you want to set yourself up for success before you go into either the workflow side of things or the information management side of the project as well. I'd like to outline a few very practical guidelines for digital hygiene that you might want to keep in mind. The first guideline is that hygiene is, as I've said, a practice. It's iterative, which means you have multiple iterations of the practice itself. You have a lot of opportunities to start over if you fall off the horse. So if you do fall off the horse, failure should prompt two sets of questions. The first is which step failed? So where's the location of the failure? And then why did that mechanism fail? So how does that mechanism work and what went wrong? Second question is, how can you simplify the process to help make sure that you don't fail in the same way again in the future? Again, it's iterative, so you always have a second chance. So failure is a really great opportunity to reflect on why your process isn't working. This is one of those metacognitive techniques that I talked about in a previous video. The second guideline that you might want to keep in mind is that conventions should serve practice, not the other way around. This just means that having standard conventions across different disciplines of activity, maybe you have your apartment documents in one maybe you have your apartment documents in one folder on your computer, and then your files for this class on a different computer. If you use the same naming convention across all of those things, when you start a new discipline, when you start a new folder for a new enterprise or something like that, you already have a built-in naming practice that you can apply immediately, and it will start working without you even having to touch anything. So that, on the other side of things, means that creating new conventions for every unique workflow means that you're managing not just the workflows, but also all of those different systems that you've engineered. So standard advice, generally speaking, is to design the workflow once and then don't try to reinvent the organizational wheel every time you have a new set of information that you have to organize. If you abide by this guideline, you'll be able to get creative with the product that you're delivering and not necessarily with the process. The process can fade into the background, so the product really can take the final view. The third thing I'll suggest is that you don't let practice get in the way of performance too much. So a good way to, put this guideline into practice is by building in some slack in your system. Not getting bogged down with the details helps you remain efficient and that kind of thing. Sometimes the process it just isn't that deep. On the other hand, you don't want to build in so much slack that you'll get complacent and your desktop will be full of 87 different files because you haven't kept up with your system. So because you can get bogged down with the details and your desktop can look really terrible, after a while, you want to try to build in systems that are simpler rather than more complex. The simpler solutions obviously are much more flexible and forgiving, depending on your needs as they change across different disciplines and that kind of thing. I'll give you a theoretical explanation of the example that I'm about to show you towards the end of this video. So I was having the problem that I was not able to keep track of all of the different versions of documents that I was sending to a professor. This was a few years ago. And I wanted to keep track of these different versions because they kept giving me comments on different versions that I would send them, and sometimes the comments would be contradictory, so I wanted to compare and contrast the different comments that they'd made throughout time. If I'd stuck with the same document itself, I would have just overwritten the comments, and then in the course of my revision process, I would have lost all of those comments and that feedback, and I'd have to then go back through my inbox and find that email and re-download the draft that they'd commented on and that kind of thing. That's a great example of when practice is getting in the way of performance. Editing the same file over and over again to respond to feedback is a very useful solution in the short term, but again, in the long term, it's not quite as practical because you have to do all of this extra work just to access previous versions of your file. When I asked myself the question, what step is failing, I came to the conclusion that I was not being very efficient or economical or forward-looking when it came to the way that I was managing my drafts. And the reason I failed was because I was not differentiating between versions. This is most easily done immediately after I've delivered them, so as soon as I send them off. So I wasn't taking the necessary post-process reflective steps to set myself up for success, if you will. So my solution was to devise a naming system based on the date that I delivered a certain file. And again, I'll show you exactly what this looks like in just a moment. This also meant that I was not using the same file over and over again and rewriting over comments that I'd receive and that kind of thing. I'd have to click Save As. Google Docs has a similar function if you create a new document or like copy. I'm not sure what exactly it is in Google Docs, but there's a similar kind of function. This will allow you to preserve those comments without having to click back over and over and over and over again through OneDrive or Google Docs built-in version management systems and trying to find that comment and then click all the way back through to the present version that you're trying to edit right now in the moment. Having different versions means you can just pull them up either in separate windows or separate tabs if you're using a cloud-based system. Just as a side note, I think Dropbox has something similar. Again, I like to use Microsoft products just because I use Excel and PowerPoint and Word. OneDrive serves essentially the same function as Google Docs sort of as a whole, so I'm using them interchangeably. If we open up this problem and the solution to the second guideline, which is making conventions serve my practices and not making my practices adapt themselves to new conventions each time I open up a new world of practice, I found that this naming convention solves similar problems with naming systems across different disciplines. So I've now made it a sort of universal habit. Saving everything by the date that I've delivered it means that there's an easy to navigate built-in architecture that I don't have to think about every time I want to go back and say, oh shoot, where did I put that file? What month was it? What year was it? What class was it? That kind of thing. It's already built in and I know exactly how to find it. That's not to say, however, that this naming convention didn't open up a whole new problem, which is that I was letting sometimes my practice get in the way of performance. So my naming system is obviously totally useless, as I mentioned, if you have a desktop full of documents and folders and all of that kind of thing. You can't visually sort through all of that information. I have 2 or 3 drop zones. One is my personal drop zone. The other is the one for this class and my teaching work. And then the third, obviously, is for my own research for my PhD. These 3 drop zones allow me to assign it to one of these 3 drop zones and not even worry about the naming system after I actually name the file. I don't have to think about filing it away in the proper file and all of that. I can just actually get to the content that I'm trying to address, and it will be off my desktop, right? The drop zone allows me to keep track of in-process files, and then I can move them when I've delivered them. I'll move them to a file. Let me show you what this actually looks like in practice. So we'll go to the screen recording section of the video now. Hello, it's me again. This time I'm screen sharing on my iPad just so I can annotate what you're seeing on the screen. This is a screenshot that I've taken of my file structure for our class. The first folder in my Fall 2020 English 121 file is a file called Documents by Date Produced. You'll note that all of the items in the folder are folders themselves that are all named according to that naming convention that I've just discussed. I have on the first section of each name the date I delivered the file. So that's the date that I sort of shipped the contents of that file. That's always the same. As you can see, it goes all the way down. The next thing that is in each name is the topic or the title of whatever is contained in that folder. All of the contents of each of these folders has, maybe there's 1 or 2 items in it, or 3 or 4 items, but they're all named in a similar fashion. If we go down a little bit more, we have my drop zone for this class. You'll see also I'm using the exact same naming structure that I've used above. This is because after I've finished the project or the file, after I've delivered the deliverables, so to speak, I will put it in its own corresponding folder, and then I'll move that folder up to the folder that we were just in, which is Documents by Date Produced. So I'm already beginning the data management process just by the naming convention that I slap onto it as soon as I create the file. The third folder I want to note is this PDF Readings by Author Surname. This is a folder that's really specific to classwork, to our class in particular. I'd like to keep clean versions of each reading in case I need to distribute it to a student or something like that, or upload it to Blackboard. I'll keep all of the clean versions of the PDFs by author surname. So with articles, I'll put the author's surname, so in this case, Anyan, and then the article title is called Social Class and School Knowledge. If it's an excerpt from a book, I do something slightly different in order to differentiate between standalone articles and books elsewhere in one of my other files. I always capitalize every letter of the book title just so I can remember to myself, oh yes, this is a scan from a book and not a standalone article. So it's the same naming convention, it just indicates a different type of source, if you will. Now, by the magic of editing, we're zoomed in on a fake folder I've made just for this discussion. It's actually in my drop zone right now. You'll see it abides by this naming structure. I made it obviously for the video today, and we have our example folder for our file management video. We have similar structures here, ones that you might want to consider replicating on your own. The first folder is our class readings by due date. This is, if I were a student taking this class, I'd download the readings before class, I'd put them in their own file, and I'd annotate them, and then I put them in this class readings by due date. This is really useful if you, for example, come late to class, you have to pull up the reading really quickly, you can pull up the PDF and see all of the notes that you made on it so you can contribute immediately to class discussion. You don't have to go rifling through Blackboard to find the PDF, download a new version. Oh my gosh, okay, I gotta reskim everything to make sure I'm situated. Managing all of this on your own is a great way to be sure that you're always on top of your readings. Our next folder is documents by date produced. This is really similar to the first one that we looked at. It's pretty self-explanatory. We have this delivery date here. I generally speaking always do the delivery date, not necessarily the date something is due, because I want to try to manage those versions of each file like I mentioned earlier in this video. It doesn't really matter though, whatever works best for you. You can use or not use this or anything in this video, really. Then the last folder that we have here is obviously my custom drop zone for this fake folder that I'm suggesting for your file structures. Within the drop zone, as soon as I create a document that's related to the class, I immediately save it to the drop zone. If you're working in something like Google Docs where it doesn't necessarily require you to save something directly to a folder, you can just open up, start typing, and it's already saved in the cloud. You might want to get in the habit of saving it to one of your folders just so that you have some baseline level of organization going forward. I'll slap a title on it as well. You can always change either one of these elements at a later point. The point is just to get it filed in a very, very preliminary layer just to start, so that you're a little bit more prepared when you have to refer to a reading or a file or a piece of writing that you've produced for a class. You can do so reliably, and everything looks rather similar across your different classes, and you know where to find things, and you know exactly how to get there in the future if the need arises. That's all for now. I encourage you to investigate on your own various different ways to annotate PDFs. I walked you through in our original video, and I'll include a link to that down below. A little bit about how I use Adobe Acrobat. I think it's the best PDF editor. If you're using a tablet, I use an iPad just because I clearly love writing on things, even though my writing is, chicken scratch. You can't actually read it ever. I really like using this app called PDF Expert. If I remember correctly, it's a pretty hefty fee, but I think it was only one time. I use it every day for multiple hours every day, so the purchase was pretty easy for me. I would encourage you to shop around and decide which option is best for you. If you are looking for something pretty basic, you just want to be able to highlight things and add stickies or comments in the margin or something, most will do that. If you want to get a little freaky with it and explore some more advanced functionalities, the world is your oyster. There's a lot of boutique solutions to very specific boutique problems. So I hope this was useful. I hope you aren't totally bored. I realize we're at like 17 minutes right now. I thought I would walk you through an example of how to put these principles and guidelines into practice in a rather concrete way. That's all for now. Bye.